On her wedding night at 45 years old, Linda Jonathan lay crouched beneath the king-sized frame of the bridal suite, her designer silk gown pooling around her like a crushed lily. She held her breath, stifling a playful giggle, chasing a rare spark of girlhood mischief she thought she'd outgrown long ago. It was meant to be a harmless prank, a soft laugh to break the tension of a high-stakes day, a private memory to cement a marriage built on mutual respect. Then the heavy mahogany door clicked shut. The footsteps were wrong. Not the singular, confident stride of her husband, but a synchronized rhythm of two. Linda's smile vanished as a familiar, high-pitched laugh filled the room, a sound that belonged to her best friend, not her wedding night. From the shadows beneath the bed, Linda watched as her sanctuary collapsed into a crime scene. She listened as "forever" was revealed to be a hostile takeover. And as the man she had just crowned her partner exposed the predatory heart beneath his tuxedo, Linda didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She stayed in the dark and learned the truth. Dear viewers, this is the story of a woman who was kicked while she was down, both figuratively and literally, only to discover that the man who claimed to be her peace was the biggest threat to her future. It is a story of how a single act of cruelty, intended to crush a woman's spirit and steal her legacy, became the very spark that burned down a predator's elaborate heist. Linda Jonathan didn't just survive a betrayal. She audited a lie and reclaimed her throne. Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we end our journey today, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps these stories of resilience and justice alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten. Voices like Linda's, and stories that remind us that our strength is our own. In the comments below, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are building a community that values the truth. We are keeping hope alive. Linda Jonathan had spent 2 decades convincing the world, and herself, that she didn't need a protector. At 45, she was the architect of her own empire, a woman whose name commanded boardrooms and respect. She had learned to navigate the world with a sharp mind and a guarded heart, believing that romance was a luxury she couldn't afford to mismanage. But when she had stood before the mirror hours earlier, adjusting her veil, she allowed herself to believe that Simon Chamberlain was the one man who didn't want to shrink her. She had met Simon 18 months ago at a black tie gala in Manhattan. He was refined, articulate, and seemed entirely unthreatened by her success. A consultant with a thriving firm, he spoke of partnership and legacy. He was the first man who didn't look at her balance sheet as a challenge, but as a shared foundation. After years of being told she was too much for the average man, Linda found solace in Simon's calm. Their courtship was a masterclass in sophistication. Gallery openings, strategy sessions over vintage wine, and conversations that felt like 2 powerful rivers merging into one. To Linda, that felt like evolution. At her age, she valued a power-coupled dynamic over fleeting passion. Simon never competed with her. He championed her. He listened with rapt attention as she spoke about the sacrifices she made to build her firm. He was her loudest cheerleader, her most dependable confidant. When he proposed, It was a grand gesture atop a skyscraper, framed as a merger of souls. It felt like the ultimate victory. The wedding was a masterpiece of black excellence, opulent, televised in social columns, and attended by the city's elite. The word perfect was whispered by every guest. A perfect match. A perfect union. Simon's colleagues toasted him as a man of vision, a man who finally found a woman worthy of his ambition. Linda had beamed at the praise, never imagining that vision was actually a target on her back. Her maid of honor, Christiana Jetter, had stood by her side throughout the day, adjusting Linda's train with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You've worked so hard for this, Linda," Christiana had whispered in the dressing room. "You deserve everything that's coming to you." Linda had hugged her, grateful for a friendship she thought was unbreakable. She was tired of being the only one at the top. That night, the penthouse suite was a cathedral of glass and white roses. It was the physical manifestation of the life Linda had earned. As Simon stepped out to check on the late-night catering, Linda felt a sudden, uncharacteristic burst of playfulness. She wanted to be the girl who laughed, not just the CEO who led. She slipped off her heels, gathered her heavy silk skirts, and slid beneath the bed, heart racing with the thrill of a silly surprise. She waited in the silence, listening to the hum of the city 80 floors below. When the door finally opened, her body tensed with anticipation. The door swung wide, but there was no solitary Simon. There was the rustle of a second silk dress, Christiana's bridesmaid gown. The footsteps were intimate, overlapping. Linda's brow furrowed. Maybe Christiana had forgotten something? Then, the silence was broken by a wet, lingering sound, a kiss. "God, I thought today would never end." Christiana's voice drifted down, sharp and devoid of the warmth she'd used all day. "How much longer do we have to play act, Simon?" Simon's voice followed, colder than Linda had ever heard it. "As long as it takes to get the signatures. The boutique's debt won't pay itself, and her pension is too big a prize to rush." Linda's fingers clawed into the expensive carpet. Her pulse thundered against the floorboards. This wasn't a prank anymore. Through the gap in the bedskirt, she saw Christiana's designer heels kick off, landing right next to Simon's discarded tuxedo shoes. "She's so blind," Christiana laughed, stepping closer to the bed. "She actually thinks you love the strength she's so proud of." "I love the equity," Simon replied, his shadow falling across the floor like a shroud. "Tomorrow, the real work begins." Linda Jonathan had spent her entire life building walls, not just of brick and mortar, but of the kind of professional reputation that felt bulletproof. At 45, she was the CEO of Jonathan Strategic Consulting, a firm she had raised from a 2-desk operation in a cramped Harlem apartment to a sleek, glass-walled powerhouse in Midtown. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper instincts, known in the industry as a fixer who could look at a failing corporate infrastructure and see exactly where the rot started. She was used to being the smartest person in the room, a position that came with a solitary, glittering kind of power. But in the quiet hours, when the city lights of Manhattan hummed outside her penthouse, she often felt the weight of her own self-sufficiency. Men had always been a complicated variable in Linda's equation. In her 30s, they were intimidated by her drive. In her early 40s, they were resentful of her bank account. She had grown accustomed to the slow fade, the way men would initially be drawn to her brilliance, only to shrink when they realized she didn't need them to pay her bills or validate her existence. She had accepted that her happily ever after might just be a very successful quarterly report and a quiet glass of Bordeaux. Then came the gala for the Metropolitan Arts Fund, and with it, Simon Chamberlain. Simon hadn't approached her like a predator or a fan. He had approached her like an equal. He was a black man of striking presence, with salt and pepper hair that gave him an air of seasoned wisdom and a smile that seemed to say he knew a secret they were both in on. While other men tried to impress her with their portfolios, Simon spent their first hour together asking her about the specific challenges of minority-owned tech scaling, a niche subject she was passionate about. He didn't just listen, he engaged. He challenged her points with a respectful, intellectual rigor that made her blood hum. He began what Linda now realized was an audition of the highest caliber. Simon was a consultant himself, though his firm was boutique, specializing in discreet wealth management. He presented himself as a man who had already reached his mountain top and was simply looking for a companion to enjoy the view. He never asked her for a favor. He never hinted at needing a connection. Instead, he became the ultimate support system. When Linda had a grueling week of back-to-back board meetings, Simon didn't complain about the canceled dinner dates. He sent a curated basket of her favorite high-protein snacks and a note that read, "Go kill it. I'll be here when the dust settles." When she expressed a rare moment of vulnerability about the loneliness of leadership, he didn't try to fix her. He simply sat with her in the silence, holding her hand with a grip that felt like a promise of stability. He was a master of the small, significant details. He remembered the name of her first-grade teacher. He knew she liked her coffee with exactly 1 drop of oat milk. He brought her flowers, but never roses, always lilies, because he knew she found roses cliché and predictable. He made himself indispensable by filling the gaps she didn't even know she had. He became the safe harbor she had spent 20 years pretending she didn't need. The social circles of New York's black elite quickly dubbed them the Golden Couple. They were a vision of collective power. At charity auctions and gallery openings, they moved in a synchronized orbit. Simon was the charming diplomat to Linda's iron-willed strategist. He seemed to glory in her success, standing back with a look of pure pride as she accepted awards or closed monumental deals. He was the protector who didn't stifle, the partner who didn't compete. Even her friend Christiana Jeter, usually the first to point out a man's flaws with a surgical precision, seemed won over. "He's the one, Linda," Christiana would say over brunch, her eyes bright. "He's the only man I've seen who can stand in your shadow and still look like a king. You've finally found your match." Linda had allowed herself to believe it. She had lowered the drawbridge. She had shared her passwords, her private fears, and the keys to her estate, believing that Simon Chamberlain was the reward for a lifetime of struggle. She didn't see the calculation behind the charm. She didn't see that every supportive text, every thoughtful gift, and every selfless act was merely a down payment on the heist he was planning. She was a woman who prided herself on seeing the rot in every structure, yet she had failed to see that the man she was marrying was not her foundation. He was the termite. The wedding had been the final act of the audition. It was a day of absolute, blinding perfection. As she walked down the aisle, seeing Simon's eyes well with what looked like genuine tears, Linda felt a profound sense of relief. She thought she was finally safe. She thought the golden couple was a reality. She had no idea that the man waiting for her at the altar was already looking past her, counting the seconds until he could stop being the perfect husband and start being the perfect thief. He had passed the audition with flying colors, and now the real show was about to begin. The cool, industrial scent of the hotel's premium carpet was the only thing Linda could focus on as she adjusted her heavy silk skirts in the darkness beneath the bed. It was supposed to be a 5-minute prank, a rare moment of levity to puncture the high society seriousness of the day. She could almost picture Simon's face, that handsome, stable face, breaking into a surprised grin when he realized his stately wife was hiding like a schoolgirl. But when the penthouse door clicked shut, the vibration that traveled through the floorboards wasn't the steady, familiar rhythm of one man. It was the frantic, overlapping staccato of two people moving in haste. Linda's heart gave a sharp, painful tug. Through the narrow gap between the dust ruffle and the floor, she saw the hem of a bridesmaid's dress, the distinct champagne-colored tulle she had picked out herself. Then came the heels, Christiana's favorite gold stilettos. They didn't stop at the door. They moved deep into the room, followed closely by the polished black Oxford Simon had worn to say, "I do," only hours before. The silence of the room was shattered not by a search for a missing bride, but by a sound that made the air in Linda's lungs turn to ice. It was a sharp, hungry intake of breath, followed by the unmistakable rustle of fabric against fabric and the low, guttural moan of a man who was no longer pretending to be restrained. Linda froze, her cheek pressed against the cold floor, her eyes wide in the gloom. "Finally," Christiana whispered. The voice was high, breathless, and stripped of the polished elegance she had displayed at the altar. "I thought that reception would never end. Watching you toast to forever with her nearly made me sick, Simon." "It was a performance, Chris." "Nothing more," Simon replied. The sound of his voice sent a shiver of pure dread down Linda's spine. It wasn't the warm, resonant baritone that had whispered poetry into her ear during their courtship. It was flat, transactional, and edged with a terrifyingly sharp authority. It was the voice of a man discussing a business acquisition he found tedious but necessary. "You were so convincing," Christiana giggled, and the sound felt like a serrated blade against Linda's skin. "The way you looked at her when she walked down the aisle. I almost believed you actually liked the powerful woman routine." "I like what the powerful woman owns," Simon snapped, his footsteps moving toward the bar. The clink of crystal against glass echoed in the hollow space under the bed. "Do you have any idea how much she has tied up in that executive pension? Not to mention the equity in the Harlem building. She's been so busy being competent that she never noticed I was restructuring the prenuptial disclosures right under her nose." Linda's fingers curled into the carpet, her nails digging deep. The man speaking above her was a stranger wearing her husband's skin. "She's a fixer, Simon," Christiana reminded him, her voice moving closer to the bed. "She's built a career on spotting the rot in other people's companies. What happens if she spots it in you?" "She won't," Simon said, and Linda could hear the predatory smirk in his tone. "She's exhausted, Chris. Women like Linda spend so much time being the hero that they are desperate for someone to tell them they can finally stop. I gave her the one thing she couldn't buy for herself, the illusion of safety. As long as I keep playing the doting partner who isn't threatened by her, she'll hand me the keys to the kingdom just to keep the peace." A heavy weight shifted onto the mattress above Linda. The springs groaned, and she squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the literal pressure of their betrayal hovering inches above her head. "And my boutique?" Christiana asked, her voice dropping to a needy purr. "Consider the debts settled," Simon promised. "Once the joint accounts are fully integrated next week, I'll funnel the marketing investment through your LLC. By the time she realizes the money is hemorrhaging, we'll be 6 months into the difficult first year of marriage, and I'll have enough leverage to make a divorce too expensive for her to fight." "You're a monster," Christiana murmured, though it sounded like a compliment. "I'm a businessman," Simon corrected. "And Linda Jonathan was the best investment opportunity on the market. Now, stop talking about her. This is our wedding night, too, isn't it?" The laughter that followed was a cruel, discordant melody that filled the suite. Under the bed, in the suffocating darkness, the woman Linda used to be died. The competence complex she had been accused of, the iron-willed strategist everyone feared, finally woke up. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She watched the gold heels kick across the floor and the tuxedo jacket hit the chair. She reached into the folds of her silk gown, her hand trembling only slightly as she found her phone. With practiced, silent precision, she hit the record button. She had spent her life fixing other people's ruins. As she listened to the man she loved plan her financial execution, Linda realized she had one last job to do. She wasn't a victim trapped under a bed. She was a witness in a boardroom she now fully intended to burn down. The sound of the betrayal was loud, but the sound of her silence was the beginning of her war. The air beneath the bed grew thick with the scent of Christiana's signature perfume, a cloying, expensive jasmine that now smelled like rot to Linda. Above her, the mattress shifted again as Christiana let out a jagged, triumphant sigh. The intimacy of their movement was a physical blow, but it was the casual cruelty of their conversation that began to sharpen Linda's shock into a cold, hard edge. "I still can't believe she fell for the ring," Christiana said, her voice muffled slightly by the pillows. "She's supposed to be this diamond-sharp executive, yet she didn't even question the vintage provenance you spun for her. She actually cried when you put it on her finger." Linda felt a phantom weight on her left hand. The ring was a stunning Art Deco piece, heavy platinum with a sapphire center that Simon had claimed was a family heirloom, a piece of his history he wanted her to carry. It had been the cornerstone of his narrative, the idea that he was bringing her into a lineage of stable, honorable men. Simon's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "The history was all your idea, Chris. And a brilliant one at that. She was so obsessed with the sentiment of a family legacy that she didn't bother to look at the merchant codes on her own corporate card statements. Why would she? She trusts her best friend to manage the discretionary bridal accounts. Linda's heart skipped a beat. Her corporate black card, the one she had entrusted to Christiana to handle the wedding's minor logistics and vendor deposits to save Linda time, flashed in her mind like a warning light. It was almost too easy, Christiana continued, her tone dripping with a mix of boredom and malice. I just funneled the purchase through the floral and decor line item. The jeweler in the Diamond District is an old contact of mine. He was more than happy to split the transaction into 4 smaller, inconspicuous payments. You got the credit for being the romantic traditionalist, and Linda literally paid for her own shackles using her executive travel rewards. Those points she was saving for a dream honeymoon in the Maldives? They covered the sales tax and the insurance premium. Under the bed, Linda's jaw tightened until it ached. She remembered the night Simon had proposed, how he had knelt in that dimly lit garden and talked about how the ring represented a bond that couldn't be bought. It had been bought, all right. It had been bought with her own sweat, her own late nights in the office, and the blind trust she had placed in a woman she had known since their sophomore year of college. She's going to notice eventually, Simon, Christiana said, the bed springs creaking as she moved. She's a hawk with numbers. Even with the shell company I set up for the boutique's consulting fees, a woman like Linda Jonathan doesn't stay blind forever. She stays blind as long as she's distracted by happiness, Simon countered. Linda could hear the sound of him pouring another drink, the liquid splashing into the glass with terrifying calmness. I've spent 18 months studying her. Linda doesn't look for betrayal because she thinks she's too smart to be betrayed. She thinks her success is a shield. I've just been holding the shield for her while I unbolt the armor from the back. Well, the armor is off now, Christiana whispered. The boutique gets the infusion on Monday, right? Monday morning, Simon confirmed. The joint filing we did for the insurance on her property yesterday gave me all the signature samples I needed for the wire transfers. By the time she wakes up from this wedding haze, the foundation will be gone. She'll have the title of wife, and we'll have the capital. Linda watched a stray feather from the duvet drift slowly toward the floor, settling near Christiana's discarded gold heels. She realized then that Christiana hadn't just been a bridesmaid, she had been a scout. Every late-night vent session over cocktails, every secret Linda had shared about her firm's vulnerabilities, every detail of her financial structure had been fed to Simon like raw meat. Christiana hadn't been helping her plan a wedding. She had been helping Simon plan a heist. The ring on Linda's finger suddenly felt like a hot iron. It wasn't a symbol of love or even a family heirloom. It was a receipt. It was a physical manifestation of her own gullibility. But as she lay there, recording every word of their casual confession, the heat of the ring began to fuel something else. The maid of dishonor and the perfect husband were still talking as if the game was already won, unaware that the woman they were burying was currently taking notes. Linda wasn't crying anymore. The tears had dried into a salty mask of determination. They thought they were draining a pension, but they were actually providing the evidence for their own destruction. She would let them have their wedding night. She would let them believe the hawk was sleeping. But as the recording light on her phone flickered steadily in the dark, Linda Jonathan began to draft a new contract, one where the final payout would be a cold, calculated justice. The shadows beneath the king-sized frame felt like they were shrinking, the air growing thinner with every breath Linda drew. She lay paralyzed, her cheek pressed against the expensive pile of the carpet, listening to the muffled sounds of the two people she had trusted most in the world reclaiming the space above her. Every shift of the mattress, every low murmur of satisfaction from Simon, and every sharp, triumphant giggle from Christiana felt like a physical blow to her ribs. She was a woman who had built an empire on her ability to read people, yet she was currently entombed beneath the evidence of her own catastrophic failure. Time became a distorted, agonizing thing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the two conspirators moved about the suite with a casual, domestic ease that was more insulting than the betrayal itself. Linda watched through the sliver of space beneath the bed skirt as Simon's tuxedo trousers were tossed carelessly onto the floor, followed by the rustle of Christiana's bridesmaid gown. They spoke in the shorthand of long-term lovers, discussing the infusion of Linda's capital into Christiana's boutique with the same dry detachment one might use to discuss a bank loan. There was no remorse in their voices, only the cold, hard efficiency of two predators who had successfully cornered their prey. Linda's body began to ache, a dull, throbbing protest from her joints and the muscles of her back, but she didn't move. She didn't dare. She remained a ghost in her own bridal suite, her hands still gripping her phone as if it were a weapon. The recording light flickered like a heartbeat in the dark, capturing the sound of Simon pouring a second glass of champagne, her champagne, and the clink of glasses as they toasted to a future funded by her destruction. She realized then that the safety Simon had offered her wasn't a sanctuary, it was a blindfold. He had waited until she was at her most vulnerable, until she had finally allowed herself to believe she could stop being the guardian of her own life, to strike. Eventually, the sounds above her settled into the heavy, rhythmic breathing of sleep. But for Linda, the night was only beginning. She lay there in the suffocating silence, her mind racing with the speed of a high-frequency trading algorithm. She began to dismantle the architecture of their plan, piece by piece. She thought about the joint accounts, the forged signatures Simon had mentioned, and the marketing investment he intended to funnel to Christiana. She didn't allow herself to cry anymore. The heat of her anger had forged something colder and more useful, a strategy. It was nearly 4 a.m. when the room finally went still enough for her to move. Simon and Christiana, fueled by expensive wine and the arrogance of their assumed victory, had finally retreated to the dressing room area, likely seeking more comfortable quarters than the bed they had defiled. Linda heard the distant click of a door and the hum of the suite's secondary air conditioning unit. She moved with the slow, calculated grace of a predator. She slid out from beneath the bed, her ivory silk gown now wrinkled and stained with the dust of the floorboards. As she stood up, the room seemed to tilt. The moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows hit the discarded wedding remains, the half-empty glasses, the crumpled lace, the floral arrangements that now looked like funeral wreaths. It didn't feel like a honeymoon suite anymore. It felt like a crime scene where her soul had been the victim. She looked at the bed, the rumpled sheets a testament to the desecration of her trust. On the nightstand, her family heirloom ring sat in a crystal dish, catching the light and mocking her with its stolen sparkle. Linda didn't touch it. She didn't want the weight of her own money on her finger anymore. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the New York skyline, the city she had conquered once and would now have to conquer again. The woman who had crawled under that bed was a bride looking for a laugh. The woman who stood in the center of the room now was a CEO looking for an exit strategy. She picked up her shoes, her movements silent and precise. She looked at her phone. The recording was secure, a digital execution order waiting to be signed. She didn't wake them. She didn't scream or demand an explanation. To do so would be to give them the one thing they expected, an emotional reaction they could manage. Instead, she gathered her strength, draped her wrap over her shoulders, and walked toward the door. The room was silent, the air still smelling of jasmine and betrayal, but as Linda Jonathan stepped out into the hallway, she wasn't fleeing. She was beginning the counteroffensive. The longest night of her life was over, and the dawn was bringing with it a very different kind of business day. The sun rose over Manhattan with a sterile, uncompromising brightness that felt like an intrusion into the suite. Linda sat before the vanity, her hands steady as she applied a layer of concealer to the hollows beneath her eyes. The woman in the mirror was a masterpiece of composure, every hair in place, her expression carefully curated to reflect the soft glow of a woman recently cherished. She could hear the shower running, the steam billowing from the bathroom where Simon was washing away the evidence of a night he thought remained a secret. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a plush hotel robe and wearing that same easy, dependable smile that had once felt like home, Linda didn't flinch. She smiled back, a slow, practiced curving of the lips that reached her eyes but stopped short of her soul. She played the part of the doting bride with a terrifying precision, pouring his coffee just the way he liked it and listening as he spun a narrative about his urgent morning conference calls. Every darling and sweetheart that fell from his lips felt like a drop of acid, but she swallowed the bitterness, using it to fuel the cold engine of her resolve. "I have a few errands to run for the firm," Linda said casually, buttering a piece of toast she had no intention of eating. "Some loose ends with the London merger that I couldn't quite tuck away before the ceremony. I should be back by lunch." Simon leaned over and kissed her forehead, a gesture so patronizingly paternal that Linda had to grip the edge of the table to keep from recoiling. "Always the CO," he chuckled, his voice warm with the fake pride he had used to lure her in. "Don't work too hard. Today is supposed to be the start of our life together." The moment the door closed behind him, the mask didn't slip, it hardened. Linda didn't head to her office. Instead, she took a taxi to a nondescript brownstone in Brooklyn, the home office of Marcus Thorne, a forensic accountant known in the high-stakes world of corporate litigation as the Bloodhound. Marcus didn't care about the romance or the betrayal. He cared about the math, and right now, Linda needed someone who spoke the language of numbers. The interior of the office was cramped, smelling of old paper and stale espresso. Marcus looked up from a mountain of spreadsheets, his eyes sharp behind thick lenses. He didn't offer sympathy when Linda handed him her laptop and the digital recording from the night before. He simply went to work. He was thorough, Marcus murmured, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he accessed the mirrored accounts Linda had secretly set up months ago as a standard security precaution. He's been laying the groundwork for nearly a year. Small, incremental transfers disguised as operational expenses for your personal holdings. He wasn't just looking for a payout, Linda. He was looking to hollow you out from the inside. Linda sat across from him, her posture rigid. How much has he touched? The executive pension is still intact, but he's already filed the paperwork to change the beneficiary and the primary contact, Marcus said, turning the screen toward her. And Christiana's boutique? It's not just in debt. It's a sinkhole. He's used your credit rewards to bridge the gap for now, but the wire transfer he mentioned, the one for the marketing investment, is scheduled for Monday. If that goes through, it triggers a clause in your property insurance that gives him joint ownership of the Harlem building as collateral for the business loan. The coldness in Linda's chest expanded. It was a perfect trap, designed to use her own success as the bait. Simon hadn't just wanted her money. He wanted the power she had spent 20 years building. He wanted to own the woman the world said couldn't be owned. Can you stop the wire? Linda asked. I can do better, Marcus replied with a grim smile. I can reroute the verification pings to a private server. He'll think the money is moving, but it'll be sitting in a protected escrow account he can't see. In the meantime, we need to document every forged signature and every unauthorized access. We aren't just looking for a divorce, are we? No, Linda said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. We're looking for a total liquidation. She spent the next 3 hours in that dimly lit room, cross-referencing her life against the lies Simon had told. She watched as Marcus peeled back the layers of Simon's thriving consultancy to reveal a string of previous victims and a trail of legal settlements. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a career. As she left the brownstone and stepped back into the afternoon sun, Linda felt a strange sense of clarity. The war was silent, fought in the margins of bank statements and the metadata of forged documents, but it was a war she was uniquely equipped to win. She hailed a cab back to the hotel, her mind already moving toward the next move on the chessboard. She would return to the penthouse, she would let Simon hold her hand, and she would let him believe he was the one in control. The doting wife would be waiting for him with a smile, while the CEO prepared the final, devastating audit of his life. The following morning, the charade of domestic harmony felt increasingly like an elaborate stage play where the lead actor was beginning to stumble over his lines. Simon sat at the mahogany desk in the corner of the suite, his brow furrowed in a performance of deep concentration as he toggled between browser tabs. He looked every bit the diligent professional, yet Linda, watching him over the rim of her tea, saw only a vulture circling a carcass that wasn't as dead as he assumed. When he excused himself to take a confidential investor call on the balcony, Linda moved with a predator's silent efficiency toward his briefcase, which sat open on the velvet armchair. She didn't find a romantic itinerary or a hidden gift. Instead, buried beneath a sheaf of legitimate-looking consulting contracts, she found a manila folder that felt heavier than the rest. Inside was a document that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. It was a listing agreement for her Martha's Vineyard vacation home, the colonial estate she had purchased with her first major bonus, a place that held the memories of her mother's last summer and the only true peace she had ever known. Attached to the listing was a notarized power of attorney. Linda stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was hers, or rather, a terrifyingly accurate mimicry of hers. The loops of the L and the sharp cross of the T were identical to her own hand, yet she knew with a sickening certainty that she had never held the pen that made those marks. The date on the document was 2 weeks prior, the very afternoon Simon had taken her to a celebratory lunch, where he had insisted on ordering a bottle of vintage wine that had left her feeling uncharacteristically drowsy. He hadn't just been courting her, he had been harvesting her identity. The paper trail didn't stop there. Tucked behind the listing was a series of correspondence with a high-end real estate liquidator. Simon wasn't just trying to sell the property. He was trying to fire sale it for 70 cents on the dollar, provided the transaction could be closed within 30 days. Exactly enough time for a honeymoon to conclude and a strategic disappearance to begin. He was turning her history into liquid cash to pay off Christiana's debts and secure their escape, treating her legacy like a clearance rack at a closing department store. A shadow fell across the room, and Linda slid the folder back into the briefcase just as the balcony door slid open. Simon stepped inside, rubbing the back of his neck with a practiced air of exhaustion. "Investors," he sighed, offering her that familiar, disarming smile. "They see a wedding as a distraction rather than a milestone." "I'm sorry, Linda. I'm trying to keep them at bay so we can focus on us." Linda felt a surge of nausea so strong she had to turn toward the window to hide the flash of pure loathing in her eyes. "It's fine, Simon," she said, her voice a masterpiece of controlled warmth. "I understand the pressure. In fact, it makes me appreciate you more. Most men would be intimidated by a woman with so much to manage, but you just step right in and help me shoulder the load." "That's what a partner does," he said, walking over to wrap his arms around her waist. Being held by him felt like being coiled by a snake. She could feel the heat of his skin through her silk robe, a reminder of how close she had let this threat get to her heart. As he whispered promises of a quiet weekend away into the nape of her neck, Linda's mind was already back in that Brooklyn brownstone with Marcus. She realized now that freezing the bank accounts wouldn't be enough. Simon had moved beyond mere theft. He was attempting to erase her ownership of her own life. She realized with a chilling clarity that the Martha's Vineyard house was likely just the beginning. If he had forged a power of attorney for her real estate, he had likely done the same for her firm's intellectual property. He was a paper trail assassin, using the very bureaucracy she respected to dismantle her world. But as she leaned her head back against his shoulder, pretending to relax into his embrace, Linda began to formulate a counterstrike that wouldn't just stop the sale. She would let him continue to think he was the one holding the pen. She would wait until he attempted to finalize the sale, allowing him to walk right into the trap she and Marcus were currently building. She would watch him sign his own confession in a room full of people who actually knew what her signature looked like. Simon Chamberlain thought he was selling a house, but Linda Jonathan was preparing to sell a story, one that would end with him in a cage of his own making. "You're so quiet today," Simon murmured, his grip tightening slightly. "Just thinking about the future," Linda replied, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "It's amazing how quickly everything can change once you finally see things for what they really are." The afternoon sun beat down on the outdoor terrace of the Bistro Vert, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the linen tablecloth. Linda sat perfectly still, her posture a masterpiece of executive grace, watching Christiana approach. Her best friend looked radiant, wearing a sundress that Linda had helped her pick out and carrying a designer handbag that had likely been funded by a loan from Linda's own wedding accounts. It was a surreal experience, looking at a woman who had spent 20 years in her inner circle and realizing she was looking at a stranger, a scavenger who had been waiting for the right moment to feast on the remains of Linda's life. "You look exhausted, darling," Christiana cooed, leaning in to press a dry, perfumed kiss against Linda's cheek. "I suppose the first few days of marital bliss are draining in the best way possible, right?" Linda smiled, a slow, predatory curving of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Exhausted isn't the word, Chris. Enlightened, maybe. It's amazing how much you can see when you finally stop moving and just listen." Christiana paused, her glass of Chardonnay halfway to her lips. She laughed, though the sound was a fraction too high, a thin silver bell ringing in a drafty room. "You've always been so philosophical. I'm just happy to see you finally settled. Simon is such a rock. I was talking to him briefly this morning about your honeymoon plans, and he's so dedicated to making sure you're taken care of." "He is dedicated," Linda agreed, picking up her salad fork and examining the tines as if they held the secrets of the universe. "In fact, he's been so helpful with the finances that I've had time to do a little deep cleaning. Professional cleaning, I mean. I had a fascinating meeting with my auditor yesterday. We were looking into some strange merchant codes on the corporate accounts." The color didn't leave Christiana's face all at once. It drained slowly, like water from a cracked basin. She took a long, hurried sip of her wine. "Merchant codes? That sounds incredibly boring for a woman on her honeymoon." "You'd be surprised how interesting the boring things can become," Linda continued, her voice as smooth as tempered glass. "For instance, we found a series of charges at a high-end jeweler in the Diamond District. 4 separate payments, all disguised as floral and decor for the wedding. It's funny, isn't it? I don't remember seeing $10,000 worth of extra peonies at the reception." Christiana's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "Well, you know how these vendors are. They probably mislabeled the invoices. I can look into it for you, if you'd like. I still have all the contact information." "Oh, I wouldn't want to burden you," Linda said, her gaze locking onto Christiana's with a sudden, piercing intensity. "You have enough on your plate with the boutique. I heard things have been difficult lately. A little bird told me you were looking for a major investor, someone with deep pockets and a very trusting nature." Christiana's forced smile was beginning to fray at the edges. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting toward the street as if looking for an escape route. "The boutique is fine, Linda. Every small business has its cycles. Why are we talking about work?" We should be celebrating you. I am celebrating, Linda whispered, leaning across the table until she was close enough to smell the jasmine perfume that had choked her while she lay under the bed. I'm celebrating the fact that I finally know exactly who my friends are. I was actually thinking of calling that jeweler myself. And the real estate board. I've had some strange inquiries about the Martha's Vineyard property. Apparently, someone has been trying to list it behind my back. Can you imagine the nerve? Using a forged power of attorney to sell a woman's home while she's at the altar. A bead of sweat broke at Christiana's hairline, tracking slowly down her temple. She looked as though she wanted to stand up and run, but she was pinned to her chair by the sheer weight of Linda's presence. That sounds like a misunderstanding. Or identity theft. There are so many scammers out there, Linda. You have to be careful. I am being careful now, Linda said, leaning back and taking a calm, deliberate sip of her tea. I've tightened everything. Every account, every title, every signature. I've even started recording my important meetings, just for the sake of clarity, you understand. It's remarkable what people will say when they think no one is listening. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Christiana looked at Linda, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the loyal friend dropped, revealing a flicker of raw, ugly panic. She knew. She knew that the hawk had seen the shadow of the vulture. I forgot I have a fitting at 2, Christiana stammered, grabbing her bag and standing up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the stone. We'll talk later, okay? When you're feeling more yourself. Linda watched her go, a dark silhouette retreating through the bright light of the terrace. She didn't call after her. She didn't need to. She had seen the way Christiana's hands shook as she reached for her purse. The maid of dishonor was no longer a co-conspirator. She was a loose thread, and Linda knew that Christiana would run straight to Simon. She would tell him that the wind had changed, that the competent wife was asking questions that shouldn't be asked. And that was exactly what Linda wanted. She wanted them nervous. She wanted them to move faster, to make the desperate mistakes that people make when the walls start closing in. As Linda signaled the waiter for the check, she felt a grim satisfaction. The silent war was entering its final phase. She had dropped the seeds of doubt, and now she would watch them grow into a harvest of justice. The brunch was over, but the feast of consequences was just beginning. The ballroom of the St. Regis was a cathedral of gold leaf and crystal, vibrating with a low, sophisticated hum of New York's elite. It was the Investors and Innovators Brunch, an event Linda had curated months ago to celebrate her merger, but today it served a far more clinical purpose. She stood near the dais, resplendent in a structured black jumpsuit that commanded the room, her expression an unreadable mask of executive poise. Beside her, Simon played his part to perfection, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, offering charming anecdotes to a circle of venture capitalists. Across the room, Christiana hovered near the champagne tower, her eyes darting toward the couple with a frantic, jagged energy that betrayed the conversation from the day before. The air felt heavy, like the moments before a summer storm breaks. Linda waited until the room reached its peak capacity before stepping toward the microphone. The chatter subsided, replaced by the expectant silence of people who were used to hearing Linda Jonathan deliver news that moved markets. "Thank you all for joining us," Linda began, her voice steady and resonant. "Today was meant to be a celebration of new beginnings, not just for my firm, but for my life. When I married Simon 2 weeks ago, I spoke about the importance of legacy and trust. I spoke about finding a partner who values the foundation we build together." Simon beamed, nodding modestly at the crowd, the image of the supportive husband. "But as many of you know," Linda continued, her tone shifting into something cooler, sharper, "my career has been built on the audit. On the belief that if you look closely enough at the fine print, the truth eventually reveals itself. And over the last 48 hours, I have performed the most important audit of my life." A ripple of confusion moved through the guests. Simon's smile faltered, his hand dropping from Linda's waist as he sensed the sudden drop in temperature. "I'd like to share a small presentation," Linda said, gesturing toward the massive LED screens behind her. "A look at the marketing investment and asset management strategies that have been happening behind the scenes of this beautiful union." The screen flickered to life. It didn't show wedding photos. It showed a high-resolution scan of a forged power of attorney for the Martha's Vineyard estate, followed by a side-by-side comparison of Linda's actual signature and Simon's practiced imitation. Then came the bank statements, red lines tracing the flow of Linda's corporate rewards and pension credits directly into Christiana Jetter's failing boutique. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the sharp, collective intake of breath. Simon stepped toward the dais, his face contorting into a mask of righteous indignation. "Linda, what is this? This is some kind of mistake, a glitch. We should discuss this privately." "We're past the point of private discussions, Simon," Linda replied, her voice amplified through the speakers, cutting through his protest. "Because a businessman like you knows that transparency is everything." She tapped her tablet, and the audio recording from the wedding night filled the ballroom. The speakers broadcast the low, predatory rumble of Simon's voice. "She actually thinks you love the strength she's so proud of. I love the equity." Then Christiana's laughter. She literally paid for her own shackles using her travel rewards. Christiana dropped her glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound like a starter pistol. She turned to flee, but found her path blocked by 2 men in dark suits, not hotel security, but the private investigators Linda had retained. Simon was trapped in the center of the room, the circle of investors he had spent months courting now pulling back as if he were infectious. The golden couple was being dismantled in real time, the predator finally exposed in the light he had tried to use as cover. "The wire transfer you scheduled for tomorrow morning has been rerouted to a legal escrow account, Simon," Linda said, stepping down from the dais to face him. She was no longer the doting bride or the vulnerable target. She was the CEO closing a hostile takeover. "The listing for the Vineyard House has been flagged as fraudulent, and the Maid of Honor's boutique is currently being served with a freeze order for every cent of my capital she attempted to launder." Simon's composure finally shattered. The solid, dependable man vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered grifter. "You think you've won? You've just humiliated yourself, Linda. You're the one who let me in. You're the one who was too desperate for a husband to see what was right in front of you." Linda looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but a profound sense of relief. The shame he expected her to feel didn't come. "I wasn't desperate, Simon. I was hopeful. There's a difference. You mistook my capacity for love as a weakness, but you forgot that my capacity for strategy is what built this room." She turned away from him as the police, alerted by Marcus Thorne's documentation of the forged signatures, entered the ballroom. The investors watched in grim silence as the man who had auditioned for the role of a lifetime was led out in handcuffs, followed by a sobbing Christiana. Linda stood alone in the center of the room she had built. The high society event had become a public execution of a lie. She picked up a fresh glass of water, her hand perfectly still. The predators had become the prey, and the woman they thought they could erase was the only one left standing. She didn't look at the door as they were taken away. She looked at her guests, her head held high. "Now," Linda said, her voice reclaiming the room, "I believe we were here to discuss the future. And my future has never looked clearer." The morning after the gala, the silence in Linda's penthouse was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind that had preceded the storm. It was a clean silence, the sort that follows a fever breaking or a debt being cleared. Linda stood on her balcony, a cup of herbal tea warming her palms, and watched the sunrise ignite the glass towers of the city. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't looking at the horizon through the lens of a partnership or the filtered expectations of a man who claimed to be her anchor. She was looking at it as the sole proprietor of her own life. The legal fallout was swift and clinical. With Marcus Thorne's forensic mountain of evidence and the public recording of the wedding night confession, the annulment was being processed with a speed that mirrored the efficiency of Linda's corporate mergers. Simon and Christiana were no longer characters in her life. They were case numbers in a dockets list. The Harlem property was secure. The executive pension was locked behind new layers of biometric security, and the Maid of Dishonor's boutique was a hollow shell under investigation for grand larceny. Linda walked back inside, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. She stopped at the large mahogany desk where Simon had once performed his role of the diligent consultant. It was empty now, save for a small velvet box. Inside sat the sapphire ring, the heirloom she had paid for with her own sweat and blood. She didn't feel the urge to throw it away or scream at the memory of it. Instead, she looked at it with a detached, professional curiosity. It was a beautiful object, but it had no power over her. It was a receipt for a lesson learned at a premium price, and Linda Jonathan had always believed in paying for her education. She realized then that her competence complex, the very thing Simon had tried to use as a weapon against her, wasn't a flaw at all. It was her survival mechanism. Her ability to manage a crisis, to pivot under pressure, and to audit the rot out of a structure was exactly what had saved her from being erased. Simon had been wrong about her blindness. She hadn't been blind because she was desperate for love. She had simply been a strategist who hadn't yet been given all the data. Once the data was in her hands, she had executed the necessary protocols without hesitation. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from a long-term client, a woman who had seen the news of the scandal and the subsequent legal victory. I saw what you did, Linda. Not just the exposure, but how you held the room. When you're ready to get back to work, I have a board of directors that needs your kind of clarity. Linda smiled. It was a real smile this time, sharp, knowing, and entirely her own. She had spent a year trying to build a foundation on the shifting sands of another person's lies, thinking that a marriage would finally make her whole. But as she sat at her desk and opened her laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, she understood that she had always been whole. Her strength wasn't in her ability to keep a man or maintain the image of a golden couple. Her strength was in her ability to survive the truth, no matter how much it burned, and to build something even stronger from the ashes. She reached for a notepad and wrote a single sentence at the top. The new foundation. It wasn't about a house in Martha's Vineyard or a bank balance. It was about the uncompromising peace of knowing exactly who she was. She picked up the velvet box, walked to her safe, and tucked the ring away in the back. It would stay there as a reminder, not of a betrayal, but of a victory. As the city below began its daily roar, Linda Jonathan turned her chair toward the window. She had lost a husband and a best friend, but she had gained an unshakable clarity. She was 45. She was powerful, and she was finally, undeniably, free. The audit was complete, the books were balanced, and for the first time in her life, she realized she didn't need a protector. She was the fortress. Dear viewers, so what do you think? Did Linda Jonathan get the justice she deserved? Could you have stayed that silent, that still, beneath the very bed where your life was being dismantled, just to gather the truth? What makes a woman truly powerful? Is it the empire she builds in the boardroom, or her ability to survive the devastation of her own heart? Drop a comment and let me know. And tell me, have you ever had to be your own fixer? Have you ever had to play the part of the doting partner or the loyal friend while secretly dismantling the trap that was set for you? Or have you ever needed a friend like Susan or a bloodhound like Marcus, someone who saw past the polished mask to the battle you were fighting in the dark? We all need to remember that our competence isn't a flaw, it's our fortress. We need to honor the women who choose themselves when the happily ever after turns out to be a heist, who move mountains in the margins of bank statements because their legacy can't wait. If you were gripped by this story of a woman who turned a wedding night prank into a corporate-style takedown, about a perfect husband who met his match in a woman he underestimated, about a betrayal that ended not in tears but in total liquidation, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I post new high-stakes stories of female resilience and delayed justice every day, and you don't want to miss the next audit of the heart. Like this video if you want more stories about quiet strength, about the brilliance of a woman's intuition, about wives and CEOs who rewrite the rules of survival, and about the one moment of truth that changes everything. Your likes tell me you crave more stories about real, unbreakable humanity, the kind that thrives long after the mask falls. This is Blissful Stories, where family is defined by loyalty, not just a signature on a marriage license, where a single recorded whisper can shift a fate, and where the best redemption stories begin with a woman brave enough to listen when the world expects her to be blind. Until tomorrow, remember, You don't need a protector when you are the fortress. Sometimes all it takes is one hidden phone, one cold strategy, and the courage to choose yourself.